Afternoon, everyone. I think everybody is filtering in, but we get a pretty good critical mass to begin. So nice. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Build More, Emit Less, Growing and Greening Canada's Construction, which is a really exciting report that we're launching today. I'm Raphael, the Director of Regional Pathways and Quebec Lead here at Transition Accelerator, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. With us for this conversation, we're really happy to have Geneviève Roy, Vice President of Environment and Sustainable Development at Pomerleau, Jolene McLaughlin, Vice President of Climate and Sustainability at Ellis Don, and Morgan McDonald, Director of Corporate Sustainability at Ledcor. Nice to have you all on the call. And just before we begin, I want to acknowledge, obviously, the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live. The Transition Accelerator has staff from BC to Newfoundland, and so we recognize and respect the ongoing relationships that Indigenous peoples have to the land, and we are committed to the ongoing process of reconciliation in Canada. And just to begin, today's webinar, as I mentioned, we're launching a major new industry report, which is called Growing and Greening Canada's Construction. It's the result of a unique collaboration between 9 of Canada's largest construction companies who came together to form the Canadian Construction Sustainability Alliance, or CCSA. And the goal of today's session is simple: to show how Canada's construction sector can build more while emitting less. And to do that, we'll split the webinar in two. The first half will give a quick overview of the report and its findings, walking you through some of the key takeaways that you can take home after the report. And the second half of the webinar will focus on unpacking a little bit more some of the insights from the webinar in a Q&A and panel format. And so I invite everyone that's on the call, as the presentation goes on, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to those in the latter half of this webinar. And just to begin with some context on why this initiative matters for the industry and Canada's decarbonization goals, I'll turn it over to Geneviève Roy at Pomerleau to give us a quick walkthrough of the Alliance and the overview of the initiative. So Geneviève, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raphael. We are very pleased today, Morgan, Jolene, and myself, to share with you the results of the work and efforts of Canada's 9 major general contractor over more than a year ago. We've worked on that. So it's pretty rare that we have the opportunity to collaborate between us, especially on a topic as fundamental as fight against climate change and the decarb of construction sites. So each of our companies have worked super hard in the past years to set decarb targets, implement initiative on our respective project. But at a certain point, we cannot move forward alone and in isolation. We're super dependent on our clients' requirements, on government's ambitions, on the availability of equipment and material, electricity supply, regulation, codes, and a lot of things. And it became very clear 2 years ago that we needed to come together to collaborate. And it was honestly a bit kind of weird at the beginning, but it was so the right thing to do. So we are very proud today to present you the first alliance of major general contractors. Our mission is really to green our industry, to decarb our construction site, and to send a clear signal that we are innovative and ready to do so. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the slides, so I'm not sure which one is shown, Raphael.
It should be the overview of the initiative.
Okay, so as Raphael said, today we're presenting to you the results of work we did. Jolene and Morgan's going to give you more details, but we have partnered up with TA, Transition Accelerator, to really deliver the most comprehensive analysis that was done in Canada in construction. So we have gathered like all the emissions of our job sites together. And today we want to show you 5 high impact actions that we can do, but also smaller companies can start implementing immediately to cut down emissions and cost very significantly, as you will see. So together, the different leaders that you can see on the screen, Aecon, Bird, Chenda, Celestin, Graham, Ledcor, Multiplex, PCL, and us, Pomerleau, we're sending a signal that industry is ready to lead Canada's shift toward low carbon construction.
Thank you, Geneviève. And just to keep this presentation going, I'll flip it to Jolene to walk us through a little bit more context in terms of the project goals and some of the key descriptives that we've got from this project. So Jolene, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you both. So we know construction is essential to growth and prosperity for Canada. We provide stable jobs, establishing communities, and building constructing buildings and infrastructure that enable our daily lives. We've pulled together this data and we've recognized that constructions has the potential to be roughly 13% of Canada's emissions, which is pretty significant. This data has not been collated in any way before, and because the emissions cross a number of different sectors like transportation, like stationary vehicles, it hasn't been easy to really get a picture and to understand. So that's why this data and this work is so important and unique. The report gives us a better understanding of how the different phases create emissions and what we can do within those phases to reduce emissions. It's based on over 600 projects worth of data, and I've yet to see any compilation of this information anywhere globally, let alone for Canada specifically. But it helps us better understand and confirm some of our understanding around the impacts of using diesel on our sites and how much that contributes to emissions overall, while also helping us understand that the most intensive portions of our work are both the upfront, the civil and the site works, and the emissions tied to temporary heating the buildings through construction, or the assets as well. When we talk about life cycle assessments, that embodied carbon picture and the upfront emissions of buildings is becoming more and more common discussion. When we look at the data around life cycle assessments, this phase would be the data coming out of this report is really tied to the A5 phase, the installation process. And when we look at what's available in current life cycle analysis, the estimation is roughly 3 to 4% of a building's life cycle emissions come from this phase of building. And what we've found by doing this report is that it could be as much as 20% or more. And so we see that as a significant contributor to the building overall, but also means that as both the embodied emissions that within the materials and the operational emissions of the buildings themselves, as those come down, we're going to see more and more impact coming from this phase. And the solutions that we know will work, they're not readily accessible for us right now. And so we need some more support. You know, Genevieve mentioned that we're now working together as a group to try and move these things forward and approaching different entities, our rental partners, the federal government, and just trying to get more understanding of the pieces that we can do and more capacity to work together to reduce these emissions. So I'll pass it back to Raf now to talk about the 5 key actions that we have.
Yeah, thanks, Lillian. And just to mention as well, I should mention the presentation will be made available as well as the report that is obviously available on Transition Accelerator's website. So feel free to download those documents obviously afterwards. And I'll keep my commentary short, despite it being 100 pages plus in the report. I'll try to keep it brief, and essentially Jolene picked it off exactly where we kind of wanted to go next. So once we understood really what the picture looks like in terms of energy use, the main equipment types that are being used on sites in Canada right now, we try to walk them through essentially a 4 key dimension that you see on the left of the screen here: technical readiness, the economic viability, the operational feasibility, and behavioral acceptance. The reason why that's important for folks on the line, we can look at how to reduce emissions from job sites, only looking at emissions and the best way possible to reduce those emissions. But contextualizing those emissions reduction in the operational context for construction companies in Canada is really what we wanted to do to make sure that the recommendations are as applicable and practical as possible. And essentially, you see on the right what that analysis got out, and that analysis essentially for light equipment leads us to some immediate opportunities that exist in some of that category. The mid-sized equipment have some mid-transition opportunities as well to follow. There's some hybrid opportunities that can act as stepping stones where the electrification isn't possible right now. And for renewable diesel, Jolene mentioned how diesel is such an important component of job sites across Canada. So renewable diesel will likely play a pretty big role for approaches that cannot be electrified. And then getting those early grid connections is obviously an important factor in enabling the broader electrification of sites across the country. And so that's the kind of the endpoint of our methodology, which leads us to then, once we've gone through the process of identifying the fuels and how those fit in the various criteria that we've set, identifying which of the 5 ones we feel are the most important for the broader industry to be able to follow. And you see them on the screen now. Essentially, we've got 5 high impact actions that are described in the report that can reach at an industry-wide scale 75% of emissions reduction between now and 2040. So to walk them through very quickly, the LDV and equipment electrification is one of those opportunities, especially for early electrification, that can play a big role. There are models available for light-duty vehicles, but also small tools that can help to lower some of the gasoline use on site. The second one that you see, optimization and electrification of heating in that order, is something that can definitely improve not only the use of energy on site, but also obviously emissions stemming primarily from diesel or other types of fuel in the heating process. Renewable diesel, I touched on it in the previous slide. It can play a role in reducing life cycle emissions from the use of the fuel, and essentially is being plugged in where right now we are not seeing possible electrification alternatives to what is on the market. The fourth one I want to emphasize for a second, the grid and hybrid power solutions for generators is incredibly important, not only to reduce the energy use on site and make it lower emissions, but also just getting early grid connections is something that crosses all the different approaches that we've got in here. Getting those early grid connections enables the electrification of LDVs, it enables the electrification of heating at an endpoint. And so ensuring that companies are working not only with themselves, but that they have partners with utilities and other involved players to ensure that those early grid connections happen is a really catalytic measure for job sites across the country. And finally, you see on the bottom of the screen there, hybrid and electric equipment. There are increasingly available models that become available on the market. What we see from our analysis is, especially for the lower or lighter, I would say, emission excavation equipment, there are some models that are available now that could potentially bring about a return on investment in a decent time. We will probably see some models become more available in heavier classes over time. But those 5 actions alone, when taken at the industry-wide perspective, can make a significant dent in emissions from job sites. And finally, I'll close up here. Essentially, when we take those 5 high-impact actions and we project them over time, considering practical implementation pathways for companies in the country, we understand that this is going to get to 75% in 2040. But I think what is important for folks to take away from what you're seeing on the screen is that this isn't an overnight transition. And so companies tomorrow can decide to electrify all their sites. There needs to be a planned, strategic, and directed transition over the next few years to ensure not only that electricity becomes more available on site, that the policy environment surrounding job sites becomes favorable to those emissions reduction, but as well for companies themselves to be able to start with the low-hanging fruits and build momentum towards layering additional measures over time, such as renewable fuels or hybrid power solutions over time. And obviously, one thing that we put in there as well is that companies who are more ambitious can definitely accelerate and achieve higher reductions than what is on the screen. But the fundamental thing is this is an industry-wide picture that companies should be able to take home, assess with their companies where the lowest hanging fruits are, where the highest potential actions are, and design their roadmap at a company level, at a provincial level, with the alternatives that make sense. But these 5 high impact actions hopefully chart a path towards clearing up some space for those decisions and those discussions to happen at the company level. So I'll stop here and then I'll share or pass the baton over to Morgan to walk us through essentially the role of other players in the ecosystem and how that can play a role. Morgan.
Thanks, Raf. So as you've heard everyone mention, we can't do this alone. We believe we're more effective together as an industry. That's why we've come together in this partnership. But beyond that, we believe our industry is more effective when it's coordinated across all the other players in our value chain. So what does that look like? That's working with market and regulatory players that influence and help give us the ability to make these big moves, to make them reliably, safely, and economically. Okay, so some examples of that here. We represent the construction companies, and we know we're only a small number of them. There's many more construction companies to engage, and that work is ongoing. Collectively, our procurement power is greater. So is our ability to support development and delivery of workforce training, which is going to be part and parcel of this, to build market demand and over time to show operational expertise to be able to do all of this, make all of these changes. We're speaking with equipment manufacturers. We know that a lot of the equipment that we depend on either doesn't exist yet or exists only in small quantities or at price points that just aren't economic today. So again, making that demand signal for electric, hybrid equipment, differentiated rental terms for a differentiated product. These are all details that need to be worked out and scaled. We're speaking with utilities and energy providers. What are the opportunities and the barriers for streamlining grid connections, early grid connections on projects, some of them in very remote sites? What needs to be coordinated and made available for charging infrastructure for all of this electric equipment? Okay, these details need to be coordinated. We're speaking with fuel distributors. That accelerated uptake of renewable diesel that we're talking about, that only works if we have widespread supply, competitive pricing. Same goes for other biofuels. We need more awareness, and we need a low friction experience for people to make that change. And importantly, we're speaking with many governmental ministries, departments, agencies. What is the regulatory environment and the incentive landscape that is going to make all of this possible? And simultaneously, the government as client, as a huge buyer of construction services. How can they fulfill that role? They already do, but again, scaling up that role, leading by example, helping us to validate and scale all of these solutions. So if we can go to the next slide. I've worked in sustainability for a long time. Many of us have, and we know low carbon solutions aren't viable. They won't scale if the costs and trade-offs are too steep, right? So what we believe we've put together here is a package of measures, and there's others too, but these are the big five. We believe these make a coordinated strategy that positively reinforces the other, critical dimensions of what makes construction work. We are supporting a path to decarbonization while also delivering on high performance and maintaining cost competitiveness, which allows us to grow, to build all the stuff that Canada needs. This is the sweet spot. And that's it for my part. Raf, back to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Morgan. So I'll take down the presentation and remind everyone. So we're going to move into the panel section where we're going to try to unpack a little bit more some of those dimensions that you saw in the presentation. If you have any questions from what you just heard or any thoughts that you have about what has been presented, please feel free to add it to the Q&A box. I will monitor the Q&A box as we go through the panel and feed those questions through to make sure you can have some insights back. But I wanted to start with essentially unpacking a little bit more of the state of play. The report really highlights the big five that you mentioned, Morgan, those 5 high impact actions that can make a real difference. I think from our perspective at TA, when we have been discussing and looking at some of the data from the 9 companies from the CCSA, there's a lot of solutions that are already being advanced in some way, shape, or form across the country. And so, Genevieve, I might start with you on that one and just helping us understand from your perspective, what is being done right now at the company level at Pomerleau or some of the other peers that you've got in the market to understand a little bit what the state of play is in the decarb space.
Well, I was thinking about that question, and there's many things I can share, but I'm going to share like one very specific initiative we're implementing over the past 2-3 years at Pomerleau, and that has a very significant impact on our emissions. So to give you a little bit of context, like our scope 1 and 2 emissions, like this year will probably fall somewhere around 65,000 tons of GHG emissions. half of it, 40% of it comes from diesel. And the vast majority of this diesel consumption comes from heating our workspace and concrete curing areas during winter. So the heating portion is super important. And you saw in the slides before that like heating optimization and electrification can have a very significant impact. So obviously we cannot electrify all this heating. So we're still using those heating machines and equipment to heat those spaces. What we did 2 years ago, and we've started working like mainly in Quebec, but now it is like coast to coast implemented, but we're using like intelligent heaters. So it looks pretty simple, but it was not like super available on the market before, but we're using like intelligent heaters that can be operated like from a distance, from basically your cell phone. So the supers are operating these machines, setting like temperatures for the heating space, and the machine operates only to maintain a certain temperature. Same as we do, especially in houses with our intelligence equipment. So there's a lot of like positive impact with that. First, obviously, we're consuming lots of less fuels. We have saved like last year up to almost $500,000 of fuel consumption. That's a lot of money being saved. And it also improves quality because we're pairing those heating units with probes connected like in the concrete. So very easy to control your temperature and ensuring you have the quality of your concrete during the curing phase. So that's one example that took us like 2 years like to really implement and work with suppliers and ensure we can use that on the vast majority of our building projects. But that's one example that can have a significant impact. I don't know, Jolene, Morgan, do you want to share any example on your side?
Well, maybe Genevieve, I'll just piggyback kind of off of what you were saying. You know, both of you mentioned how great it's been working as a collaborative unit, the 9 of us working together. And we met in person in January, and every company brought forward some different idea. Parmelo had this heating challenge, which I thought was brilliant. And so I've stolen it and now taking it to Elliston and trying to do the same thing there. You know, one of the key things with the heating challenge that Parmelo did was really just about shutting it off. It ends up saving operational costs. And so, you know, in the end, it just makes sense. And so we're trying to roll out different things like that end up just making sense. Another thing we're really trying to push through is a smart idling program. And so making sure that, you know, vehicles are not on idle just for the sake of having them run. There's instances where operationally we need that, whether they're working in a cold environment and the truck becomes their office, and so they do need to keep it warm. And so there's some consideration there. You know, if they're working on the side of the road and they've got a beacon to signal that vehicle, okay, there's some consideration there. But how can we just, you know, turn things off more regularly and end up saving money? And then obviously emissions from the end. That's kind of the way we're looking at it.
Yeah, and just very quickly, totally agree, Jolene, that the coming together and sharing case studies, success stories, challenges has been so valuable. I think we've all accelerated our knowledge, or at least our confidence in certain solutions. The other one that comes to mind is renewable diesel. Every one of us has been on the learning curve. It's not the same as biodiesel. What is it? Where can you get it? How much does it cost? What setting have you used it in? You know, and we had some on, you know, building sites or heavy industrial sites. In our case, Ledcor has been using it in a marine environment on the West Coast, and put all of this knowledge together. And that helps us as a group say, okay, we see the future for this. We see this as one of those items that has scale potential. So let's forecast what's possible with it. And same goes with all of them. The comparing and the compiling of insights has been so valuable.
That's great. Thanks for the 3 of you. And I think this shows that, anyway, to me, there's a lot of action that is already being done in the industry as of now to set this up well for further action and implementation. So this is amazing to hear. And I'll pull one of the questions from the Q&A. Or somebody asked about looking forward, really, how will the lead through demonstration plan measure and present success? Is it more at the company level or at collective levels that you would see kind of that success being measured and the tangible impacts being felt?
Jolene, do you want to go?
Sure. I think, I talked about how I stole Pomerleau's idea and used it, and I think it's got this compounding effect where we can change the way the industry operates by individually testing these things out, then sharing the lessons back to the collective and moving it forward. And I'm not sure if the question was around how we're measuring the impact of those things. And I think the reality is we measure it individually as a company, but when we can share the lessons and show the magnitude of the overall impact, it's similar to now us understanding that overall magnitude, overall impact of the emissions that is caused by the construction of a building or an asset. And so how do we then share the savings reflected together? I think the collaboration piece is really important there. And I know my CEO has said, similar to safety, we can't compete on sustainability. This is something we're going to have to move together. And I think this group is really keen on seeing that happen.
Great.
Maybe I can add to what Jolene is saying, and I totally agree with her. And also, I'm thinking about all the smaller construction companies and the subs. And I mean, we rely on a lot of small companies providing materials, working on our sites. And I'm pretty sure I can speak for the top 9, but we're all very open in supporting them. So at Pomerleau, it's rarely happening, and it should be more frequent. I mean, we're receiving sometimes calls from subtrades, small companies calling us and saying, hey, I'm trying to do this. I don't know, can you help me? And we're very open in sharing tools, sharing like lessons learned, what we did and how they can do it. So I'm encouraging everybody on the call to collaborate and reach to the bigger ones that maybe have more resources and already have tested some solutions before you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I may actually move to a similar question, but understanding the other side. I think you touched on it a little bit, Geneviève, but are there challenges that you folks have seen in coming together to share some of the learning in this project? I think, Jolene, you mentioned a little bit earlier, this is basically a first of at least North America. I think the global stage as well is probably a first. So there's a little bit of that kind of data component, sharing that data that maybe sometimes is not standardized compared to other segments of the supply chain. Curious to get your 2 cents on any challenges that you've seen in that interaction between companies.
I can add, Geneviève mentioned, it was a little bit rocky for us to get started as a collective, acknowledging that we're both competitors and peers and trying to figure out, what's the right level of collaboration, what can we move forward effectively together, and what becomes the responsibility of the individual companies. And so I think we're still navigating that through all the different individual pieces of options. But renewables diesel that Morgan mentioned earlier is a really great example. We as an individual company, Elliston has tried to get that rolled out. It's readily available for us in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver and the GTHA in Ontario. And so trying to get that onto our project sites, because we don't have the scale of demand of like a FedEx or a major distribution company, it's been challenging for us to get the right volume to the right place at the right time. And so between the 9 of us, we anticipate next spring, we're going out to our fuel suppliers. We're going to create a more collaborative and collated approach to be able to say, there's 2 Elliston sites, there's 3 Pomerleau sites, and there's a Leadcore site all in this vicinity. Can we just get renewable diesel across the board to these projects? It's going to take some work internally, both for us to define which projects are accepting of it, and then for our suppliers to figure out what that distribution actually looks like. But I think we're confident that we're going to get more success by working together on it.
That's great.
Maybe I want to add just something on that, Raphael.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to keep in mind 2 things. I mean, we are competitors, but we're also partners. I mean, we have a lot of major infrastructure jobs in Canada ongoing at this point. And I mean, For example, Aecon can be a competitor for us on certain jobs, but we're also partnering with them on other jobs. So whenever you're partnering up in a GVs, I mean, if we don't have the same ambitions or working the same way or gathering data the same way, it can be a nightmare. So I think there's a lot of value of getting a little bit more alignment and on way of doing things. And the second thing, and I think there's a lot of lesson learned, like from the health and safety sector also on that. They've regrouped and created their own alliance like almost 10 years ago. And the reason for that is that, I mean, their purpose at the end was to save lives. So we also have, I think, a mission and a commitment like towards the environment. I mean, we only have one planet. I mean, we can win jobs and make money as much as we can, but I mean, at the end, we're fighting climate change and we all need to adapt. So I think it's important to always keep in mind, I mean, what's our mission and why are we doing that alliance?
That's great. And maybe I might turn to you, Morgan, on a question that touched a little bit on what you were saying in the presentation. We've got somebody that asked, are participating construction companies seeing buyers or contractees requiring low carbon practices for construction projects? Do you expect that to kind of roll out or be a significant lever in enabling some of the actions that we identified?
Yeah, definitely. And there's been a really rapid uptake in the last few years. As I said, I've been doing this for a very long time, and some clients wouldn't ask about it, wouldn't think about it, wouldn't make it a priority to say, hey, just focus on what I need you to focus on, cost, schedule, safety, quality. And the number that have just in the past, I'm going to say 5 years, shown up with a really ambitious and authentic desire to reduce their footprint, and by extension, this is where Scope 3 connects everyone to everyone else. Really care about it. Now, having said that, when it comes down to the details, the words matter. The way a carbon reduction requirement is worded and articulated and delivered really can mean the difference between, just measuring without actually doing, and truly making an impact. And so I would always advise teams to think about, because as soon as it's put down in words, the whole team, from client to GC to trades, everyone else, the designers, everyone's going to find the lowest cost way to satisfy those words, right? So think through, is this really going to lead to impact? Is this going to lead to either doing what we already know is successful, or maybe taking the opportunity to try something? If every project pilots something, then collectively we keep learning. And that's where I've seen the difference between sort of, just as I said, measuring for the sake of measuring, and those projects where we've actually learned and grown and evolved our ability to deliver on low carbon solutions.
Awesome. That's great. And I might turn to another question, which is more about kind of the regional differentiation of this work. Obviously, this is a national report in scope. However, somebody asked, are there some regional differences where these 5 strategies are easier to implement than others? So for instance, access to renewable diesel, easier grid hookups, access to certain electrified technologies, where industry participants are piloting or implementing faster. I know you've got operations, the 3 of you, spanning from coast to coast. Are there some specific regions or regional differences you'd like to pluck out a little bit from those 5 high impact actions?
I don't mind chiming in on this one. So I think less province to province, more rural versus urban examples. And so like the renewable diesel is a specific one. It's very limited in where we can get fuel supply of it. And so that is more of a provincially aligned sort of thing. But when we look at, connecting to grids and electrification, there are different local distribution companies that have different access points and different access timelines. When I work with our team here in Southwestern Ontario, they generally get grid connection very quickly. They're working with smaller LDCs that have the ability to just kind of turn those connections down quickly. When we work in, say, the GTA and Toronto Hydro, that it's such a big organization, it's such a big entity that the delay to get on to the hydro hookup does take longer. And so there are those regional differences that we're trying to think about and trying to work through. Similarly with our rental companies, just making sure they have access for us for the different kinds of equipment that we want to prioritize within particularly our major markets, so Vancouver, Ottawa, and Toronto, but then also giving availability out east to the Atlantic provinces, and making sure some of the rural parts of Alberta have access to these things too.
That's great.
On that,
Yeah, go for it, Emit.
On that, I can add that, I mean, the public sector is such a big client for many of our companies. They're the one also sending a signal. So the big cities, Vancouver, GTA, Toronto, slowly Montreal also getting up to speed. I mean, their regulation, their codes, when they're giving like contracts, they're also sending a signal. We're expecting this level of energy efficiency. We're expecting that you're calculating emissions on your work site. We're expecting this and this electrification of your fleet. So they're sending a signal and also encouraging the transformation of the industry and the service providers and the material providers to adapt. So we're seeing a difference, obviously, like in BC, we have, I would say, like greener project with much more higher expectations. Same in Toronto, it's getting like for the past year a little bit more greener. Montreal a little bit, and some region it's you talked, Jolene, about rural and also like in cities, but also like we're really focused on decarb, but like when we talk about like material recovery and recycling, it's much more harder like in the Atlantic, as we would see in like in other regions. So obviously there's differences in the region and also culturally. If I talk like for Pomelo, our teams, some teams are easier to implement changes and adapt, and other are more, I would say, resistant, and it takes much more efforts. So yeah.
That's super helpful. And I think it connects a little bit to another question that's in the chat related to clients about, ensuring sometimes when it's not in the specs coming from the client, when it's not something that is kind of easily and readily understandable in terms of the cost premium that is around it, justifying implementing it on site, managing the kind of job sites, those that have boots on the ground in implementing those technologies can create an additional barrier. And so having kind of a menu of options to choose from, ensuring that the clients increasingly take on some of that procurement that Morgan talked about is something that's incredibly important. And I'll come back to the question of the subs, because we have one question in the chat that's about that, mentioning essentially that it's great that the group is suggesting a willingness to support the subs. It's such a fragmented part of the industry. And so is there an entity that could or should be providing that support and training to facilitate the subs to know what they can do, particularly when time-sensitive decisions need to be done about equipment purchases? Should that not be a role for construction associations? If that is not them, who should it be? So how to properly kind of frame the role that subs can play in this?
So we've been thinking about it a bit through the unions because it's a bit more of a centralized touch point for those sub-trade organizations. That education piece is still, I would call it, in development. There's still like a lot of pieces to put together to get there. But the more we can create that knowledge, whether it's on the site and create it as part of the job site interactions, the daily site meetings or whatever, and then bring it back to the union halls to get things embedded a little bit more. The construction associations could most certainly play a role in this too. I think we know we've all got to work on it together. And so it's not as if only one person can take responsibility or only one entity can take responsibility for all of these pieces. We need everybody kind of chipping in where they can. And so wherever we can find the way to get the information down, we're happy to keep pushing it down.
That's great.
Yeah, and just to add, subs is a vast category. Some of them are themselves very large, sophisticated, multi-jurisdictional companies that also have some capacity here. I would consider some of them, peers broadly to the scope and scale of what we do, and then all the way down to the very, very small local, a couple of people who clearly wouldn't have the same kind of research capacity or lobbying capacity that larger groups could. So yeah, we do need to find a way to fairly and reasonably reach the whole market. This is one of the problems is we're not really seen as a sector of the economy, construction. We get lumped in with real estate or with industry, but not an industry unto ourselves. And that's been part of this exploration, is just figuring out where is the baseline, what is the scope of the question we're asking of ourselves. That's been half of this journey together, which has been really really fascinating, and I think really groundbreaking.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, and I'll maybe drill down a little bit into the renewable diesel part of the conversation. We've got one of the questions in the chat that is about, do you see there being kind of sufficient capacity for the generation of renewable diesel? Or are there kind of larger industry levers that we need to look at to support the transition? I think one of the things this report helps to do is to kind of frame the industry's desire to move in that direction, but would probably like to get one of you to comment a little bit on kind of that renewable diesel play, and whether, I think the report mentions not only that kind of the industry coming together as some form of a buyer's club to be able to procure renewable diesel as an important market signal, but interested in getting your take in terms of how the supply of renewable diesel fits into that conversation.
So I think from our experience, it's been really challenging to get the product to the site at the right time. There's still limitations around temperature of using that kind of a product, because we want to protect our equipment as well. And so, in my mind, there's way more capacity needed. But also recognizing that it is a transitionary option to help us build to a place where we're totally off of burning anything to provide us energy. And so for the short to medium term, for sure, there's way more capacity needed. I think there was something like 6 or 7 renewable diesel or renewable production facilities expected to be built in Canada, and having that Canadian exposure will be really helpful. Talking to our fuel suppliers, I understand there's also some limitations around, as soon as you cross provincial borders, there ends up being additional costs tacked onto the product. And so how do we kind of help remove some of those barriers to be able to get it a little bit more accessible across the whole country? I think that's definitely a short to medium term effort that needs to be put in.
Great. And maybe I'll pivot to a little bit of a broader context. Obviously, in Canada, there's a lot of talk currently about climate competitiveness strategy coming from the government. There's been a shift in kind of recent years in the tone and the way that the federal government has framed some of those actions. I'm curious from your side, and coming from the insights of that report, in the context of Canada's potentially upcoming climate competitiveness strategy, what kind of recommendations or approaches would you recommend or advise the government to think about as they're developing that strategy and rolling it out?
Morgan, do you want to go, or I'll jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons we're seeing more and more of our clients realize the value of decarbonizing whatever it is they're selling. If they're looking to be an exporter, or if they have a public-facing brand, they know the consumer cares. Importing countries care about the carbon footprint of what's being made, and we're a piece of that. The building the thing that builds the thing is what construction is all about. And so it cascades down to us to also contribute. Hey, how do you help us reduce the footprint of what we're making? So there's definitely a connection, even though, and this is where it's so funny that again, construction generally not seen as an industry, but we enable industry, right? So as industry enablers, how are we part of the solution? We're obviously in there. And so I think there's definitely a role. And it's this whole ecosystem. It's really hard to carve up the economy in any way other than to see it as one whole ecosystem. We are all connected to one another. So we need to be part of that discussion, part of that solution, and that aggregated demand signal we're talking about. It's pretty big when you put us all together, big enough that we can drive industry ourselves. Jolene was talking about domestic supply of renewable diesel. When you add up all the liters that just our 9 companies alone could consume, does that justify more domestic manufacturing? It just might, let alone the cascade effect of what if we influenced others. So yeah, we're definitely right in the mix of any of those discussions.
And to Morgan's point, it's very unfortunate because there's a couple of like good regulations, initiatives, and money we can get, like grants from the government, but rarely it's adapted to the construction industry. We don't have a static operational like plan somewhere, like so we rely on sites that operate for 1 year, 2 years, moving around the country. So I think the governments and any regulators need to keep this industry in mind, the way we operate. And sometimes it's just minor criteria that can make a very big impact on us, and that opens the floor for us to apply and to move forward with innovational stuff.
Yeah, I think I'll just add, everyone's concerned about costs right now. The inflation has been a big burden on everybody from the consumer up to the big companies. But I think we have to build in a way that allows us to keep the climate as stable as possible. And so we've got to find a way to do both of these things at the same time. The way I look at sustainability, and the reason I got into sustainability, is because I'm cheap to begin with. And so efficiency as the first option ends up creating saving some money and creating more better opportunities along the line. And so wherever you're trying to build more, just try to encourage that reduction of fuel use in particular, build with less concrete, make the slabs thinner, whatever you can do to kind of push both of those things forward, that's going to keep us moving in the right direction.
Awesome. And I know we've got about 9 or so minutes. I'll squeeze in probably 1 or 2 additional questions here. But the first one is about collaboration between the group. So one of the questions in the chat is about collaboration among competitors is quite rare, which I would agree with. What made this joint effort work? And how do you see collaboration continuing? So for instance, sharing data, joint pilot projects, those sorts of things. So how did this come about, and where you see the puck going next?
Yeah, I think that's just the first step. For us, the past year was learning to work together, set also the boundaries of our collaboration. And we're already starting about like next steps and what we want to do next year. And obviously scope 3 material is a big thing. And this is something we want to address. How we want to do it. Do we want to do another report, like a deep dive in the data? Maybe, maybe not. But this is a subject important to us that we want to discuss and collaborate on. And also everything around waste material. So we're a big generator of waste construction materials, like coast to coast. What do we do with it? How can we reuse and make some value out of the material we're generating?
Great. Yeah, Jolene, do you want to jump on?
I would just say, like, I don't know that I walked in thinking it would be the space where we would share too many lessons and too many opportunities, but the way the group has evolved, we've created a really great space for us to learn from each other, to take those lessons and to learn more and then share them back to the group. And so I'm excited to see that continue over the course of the next number of years, that we can keep working together and, looking at new areas. So carbon's been a big thing that we've been talking about, but as Genevieve says, working on waste, working on circularity, all of those different pieces that come under the sustainability umbrella, how do we bring those back to the construction sector and start moving them forward in a meaningful way together? I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, and I'd say too, a lot of us, if we find each other on the same panels, or in some cases, we create our own panels where we get to collaborate together and realize we're all doing the same thing. We're all trying to make these roadmaps. And to Genevieve's earlier point, we're often partners on the same project. It would make less sense for us to have all separate roadmaps for something which by definition requires collaboration. So it's been it's been really fascinating to see how everyone has really shown up and been generous and vulnerable, and that spirit has, I think, led to some really good insights.
That's great. And maybe to broaden the circle a little bit, I know obviously this is the CCSA represents 9 of the largest general contractors in the country. For folks that may be on the line that are part of either smaller general contractor groups or that are outside looking in, what is your message to them in terms of where they can get started, what they can do, and where you kind of see the market going in the next few years? What role do they have, or advice that you could provide to them from that experience that you've had over the past year?
I don't know that I have anything brilliant to add here, but I would say like we're happy to collaborate with them also. Definitely to our subtrades who are working on our projects, we want to work together to find ways to reduce emissions, build more effectively, build more efficiently, all of those pieces. And so even smaller general contractors in the market that are looking to kind of understand things better, they can reach out to us. And I'm sure I'm speaking for Morgan and Genevieve as well, but we can help you at least get started in the right direction, and we're all going to be better when we do it together. So it's why the 9 of us got together, and it's why we want to keep supporting the rest of the industry and moving forward.
Yeah, I totally support what Jolene said. And I would say also, I mean, go like over your assumptions. I mean, most of the time we tend to think that, oh, we cannot do this because it's going to cost some money. I mean, I can tell you that the top 9 contractors, we have the same challenge. Nobody wants to spend money on sustainability, and we're all working on those like small business cases that at the end can save money for your company. So I think we have to overcome those barriers, like preconception about like assumptions that, oh, I cannot electrify my fleet because it's going to cost money. But maybe over a certain period of time, you're going to save a lot of money and bring more resilience to your company. So I think you got to be creative, innovative, and ask questions and push a little bit to move the needle a bit.
Yeah, and I'll just agree with all of that, and I'll add, the learning goes both ways. I mean, we learn from our subs and suppliers all the time, as I'm sure both of you do. That the new sensors, the new products, the new methods that allow us to deliver lower carbon outcomes. So much of that comes from the market, that where we're the buyer. And we're the one learning, oh, there's a new way to do something we've done the same way for 50 years. Let's see if we can figure it out.
That's awesome. Well, I know we're coming up on time, and maybe I'll allow any one of you any last thoughts. I know we've gone through the gamut of the key actions in the report, drilling down on specific segments, the role of other players in the market. Anything you feel like we might have missed, or things you wanted to make sure that we didn't miss for folks that are on the line in these last 3 minutes? Covered most of it.
Yeah, I think I'm good. I think I'd just say thank you to Genevieve, Morgan, and the rest of the partners in the group. And then thank you to Raf and the Transition Accelerator for helping us get this work out there. It's really exciting to see.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you to Morgan, Jolene, and all the others that are not on the call today. I mean, we have their full support, and they're a key to this whole exercise. And TA that was very good in making sense with all the data and numbers we had like put all together. And thanks for everybody on the call. Hope it just started like ignite a discussion between all of us.
Great. I'll just say from and Morgan, maybe I'll let you.
Yeah, all the same. Thank you all. Et Geneviève, bonne chance plus tard en français.
Merci.
Voilà. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.